My roommate used my Netflix password, so I used her trust fund. Seriously, Keiko? You changed the password again? Zara flopped onto our shared couch, her designer laptop balanced precariously on her knees. She wore the same thrift store sweater she'd been cycling through for weeks, the one with holes in both elbows that she claimed gave her authentic broke college student vibes. I looked up from my economics textbook, the one I'd bought used and highlighted until the pages looked like a rainbow of financial stress. It's my account, I said, not bothering to hide my irritation. I pay for it. If you want Netflix, get your own subscription. Zara's perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. The manicure was another thing that didn't quite fit her perpetually empty wallet narrative, but I'd learned not to question the small inconsistencies in her carefully constructed persona of financial struggle. God, you're being so petty about $15 a month, she said, fingers already flying across her keyboard. I thought we were friends. Her voice carried that particular whine she deployed whenever she wanted something, the same tone she'd used to convince me to cover her share of utilities last month because her job at the campus bookstore barely paid anything. I watched her type, probably logging into one of her many social media accounts to complain about her terrible, selfish roommate to her followers. Zara had cultivated quite the online presence as a struggling art student, complete with carefully staged photos of empty ramen containers and dramatic posts about choosing between textbooks and groceries. Her performance was so convincing that she'd even attracted a small army of sympathetic followers who regularly sent her care packages and Venmo donations. Maybe if you stopped buying coffee at that bougie place downtown every morning, you'd have $15 for Netflix, I muttered, returning to my textbook. The coffee shop she frequented charged $8 for a single drink, which was more than I spent on food in an entire day. But pointing out these contradictions always resulted in elaborate explanations about how she deserved small luxuries, and how I didn't understand the psychology of poverty. Zara's laptop made the distinct notification sound of a successful login, and I glanced over to see her already deep into what looked like online banking. The page loaded quickly, revealing an interface I didn't recognize, definitely not the basic student account setup I used for my own meager finances. What caught my attention wasn't the sleek design of the banking portal, but the number displayed in the account balance field. Even from across the room, I could see it contained far more digits than any college student's checking account should have. Zara? I said, leaning forward to get a better look at her screen. What exactly are you looking at? She immediately slammed the laptop shut, her face flushing red in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with panic. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the closed laptop to her chest, and for the first time since I'd known her, Zara seemed genuinely rattled. It's nothing, she said quickly. Just checking my work schedule. But I'd already seen enough to know that whatever was on that screen had nothing to do with the campus bookstore's employee portal. The banking interface had been too sophisticated, too polished, and that account balance had definitely contained commas where a broke college student's account should only have periods and maybe some negative signs. I set my textbook aside and moved to sit on the coffee table directly across from her. Zara, I saw your bank account. That wasn't a work schedule, and that definitely wasn't the account of someone who can't afford Netflix. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand to stop her. I'm not stupid. I've been covering your share of rent for 3 months because you claimed you were behind on bills. But that account had more money in it than I'll see in my lifetime. Her carefully constructed facade began to crack as she realized there was no way to explain away what I'd witnessed. Zara had always been quick with excuses and deflections, but this time she just sat there clutching her laptop, looking like a deer caught in headlights. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of months of lies and manipulation that I was only now beginning to understand. How much money do you actually have? I asked, my voice quieter now but carrying an edge that made her flinch. And don't lie to me again. I saw that balance, Zara. Nobody who's genuinely broke has that kind of money sitting in their checking account. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, I saw something I'd never seen before in her expression. Defeat. It's complicated, she said finally. My family, they have money, a lot of money, but I can't just access it whenever I want. There are rules, expectations, conditions. She laughed bitterly, a sound that didn't match the sweet, struggling student persona she'd maintained for so long. My trust fund has very specific guidelines about what constitutes appropriate expenses for a college student. The words trust fund hit me like a physical blow. Not because I was surprised that wealthy people existed, but because I'd been sharing groceries and covering bills for someone who had access to more money than most people would see in their entire lives. While I'd been surviving on generic pasta and working 2 part-time jobs to afford textbooks, Zara had been playing poverty like it was an interesting character study. How much money are we talking about? I pressed, knowing that I probably didn't want to hear the answer but needing to understand the scope of her deception. Zara's grip on her laptop tightened, and she looked away, focusing on some point over my shoulder rather than meeting my eyes. The trust fund is worth about $8 million, she said so quietly I almost didn't catch the words. I get a monthly allowance of $50,000, but I have to maintain certain appearances to keep access to the full amount when I turn 25. She finally looked at me, and I saw something almost like shame in her expression. The trustees expect me to live modestly, to learn the value of money, to develop character through struggle. I stared at her in complete disbelief, my mind trying to process what she'd just told me. $50,000 a month. That was more than my parents made in an entire year, more than I'd make in my first job after graduation. More than most families had to live on combined, and she'd been letting me pay her share of our $100 monthly Netflix bill because it was apparently part of her character development exercise. So, while I've been working 20-hour weeks at the library and eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, You've been getting $50,000 deposited into your account every month? My voice was rising, and I couldn't bring myself to care about maintaining composure. Well, I've covered your rent and utilities and groceries because you claimed you were broke? You've had access to more money than I'll make in the next decade? Zara had the audacity to look annoyed at my reaction, as if I was the one being unreasonable. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Do you know what it's like having every purchase monitored and judged? Having to maintain this perfect image of humble gratitude while secretly having more money than most people can imagine? It's exhausting. Oh, I'm so sorry that having $8 million is stressful for you, I said, sarcasm dripping from every word. How terrible that must be, having to pretend to struggle while actual struggling people like me subsidize your lifestyle. I stood up and started pacing, too angry to sit still. Do you realize I've been skipping meals to help cover your expenses? Do you have any idea what it's like to actually be broke? She opened her laptop again, and I watched as she navigated to what was clearly a shopping website. Her cart was filled with designer clothes, expensive skincare products, and electronics that cost more than my car was worth. Items that definitely weren't part of her carefully curated thrift store aesthetic, but apparently were acceptable expenses according to her trust fund guidelines. Where do you even keep all this stuff? I asked, gesturing at the screen. Because I know for a fact that everything in your closet came from secondhand stores and clearance racks. Zara's cheeks flushed again, but this time it was definitely embarrassment. She clicked through to her order history, revealing months of purchases that painted a completely different picture of her financial situation. I have a storage unit, she admitted. Everything gets delivered there. I can only wear the expensive stuff when I'm away from campus, when I'm visiting friends who don't know about the trust fund restrictions. The depth of her deception was staggering. She'd created an entire false identity, complete with props and a carefully maintained environment, all to maintain access to generational wealth while manipulating the people around her. I realized that every moment of our friendship had been built on lies. Every time she'd let me pay for her groceries, every time she'd borrowed money for textbooks, every time she'd accepted care packages from well-meaning followers who thought they were helping a struggling student, all of it had been a performance, and I'd been both her audience and her unwitting financial supporter. I need to see your banking password, I said suddenly. The words surprised even me, but once they were out, I realized how badly I needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening. If you want any chance of salvaging our friendship, if you want me to even consider not telling everyone on campus what kind of person you really are, you need to show me everything. Zara looked genuinely shocked at my demand, but after a moment of internal struggle, she turned her laptop toward me. The password is struggling student with some numbers, she said quietly. I thought it was ironic. The casual cruelty of that password choice, the way she'd made a joke out of the financial struggles that defined my daily existence, made me want to throw her expensive laptop across the room. I took control of the computer and began exploring her financial accounts with growing disbelief. The primary checking account held over $200,000, apparently the overflow from her monthly allowances that she hadn't managed to spend. Her savings account contained nearly $500,000. And then there was the trust fund itself, a massive investment portfolio that generated more in monthly interest than most people's annual salaries. But what really caught my attention wasn't the size of her wealth, it was the transaction history. Monthly payments to high-end retailers, spa services, private fitness trainers, and exclusive restaurants. She'd been living a completely separate life of luxury while maintaining her broke college student performance for my benefit. The level of calculation required to maintain such an elaborate deception was both impressive and deeply disturbing. You've been spending more on skincare every month than I spend on food, I said, scrolling through the endless list of purchases. And you let me give you my leftover pasta because you claimed you couldn't afford groceries. She had the decency to look ashamed, but it was too little, too late. The damage had been done, and my trust had been completely shattered. What happened next wasn't planned, wasn't premeditated, wasn't even fully conscious. I found myself clicking through her online banking interface, exploring the various accounts and options available to someone with her level of wealth. The system was remarkably user-friendly, probably designed to make financial management as simple as possible for people who'd never had to worry about overdraft fees or declined transactions. My student loan account was bookmarked on my own laptop, a constant reminder of the debt that would follow me for decades after graduation. $87,000 in loans, growing every semester, a financial burden that influenced every decision I made about my future career and lifestyle. Without really thinking about what I was doing, I opened another browser tab and logged into my loan servicer's website. The payment portal was familiar territory, a place I visited monthly to make the minimum payments that barely touched the principal balance. But instead of making my usual modest payment, I found myself entering Zara's banking information. The transfer amount field seemed to fill itself, the full balance of my student loans, enough to free me from decades of debt with a single click. What are you doing? Zara asked, noticing my intense focus on the screen. But I was already hitting the confirm button, watching as her account processed a payment that would change the trajectory of my entire life. The transaction completed almost instantly, displaying a confirmation number and a message thanking me for my payment. Just like that, I was debt-free. The rush of liberation was intoxicating. For the first time since starting college, I didn't have the weight of crushing debt hanging over every decision. I could choose a career based on passion rather than starting salary. I could consider graduate school without worrying about adding to my financial burden. In a single moment of impulse, I'd reclaimed years of my future. Zara stared at the screen in shock, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The payment I'd made was significant to me, but barely registered as a blip in her monthly expenses. She spent more than my entire student loan balance on clothes and spa treatments every few months, money that came to her effortlessly while I worked multiple jobs just to afford basic necessities. You can't just, she started, then trailed off, apparently realizing that I absolutely could and already had. The money was gone from her account and applied to my loans, a transfer that would be nearly impossible to reverse without admitting to the financial deception she'd been maintaining. That's theft. You stole from me. I borrowed without asking, I corrected, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. The same way you've been borrowing my Netflix password, my groceries, my rent money, my friendship, all while sitting on millions of dollars. The difference is that your trust fund won't even notice $87,000. My life just completely changed. She grabbed for her laptop, but I held it away from her. There were more accounts to explore, more ways her wealth could be redistributed to someone who actually needed it. Her monthly allowance was more than I'd need to live comfortably for 2 years. The interest from her trust fund could pay for my graduate school education without her even noticing the expense. Please, she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, her voice sounded genuinely desperate rather than performatively needy. You don't understand what you're doing. The trustees monitor everything. If they see irregular spending patterns, they'll investigate. They could cut off my access to everything. But I was already making another transfer, this time to cover the down payment on a used car I'd been dreaming about for months. The campus bus system was unreliable, and having my own transportation would open up better job opportunities in town. The $12,000 barely registered in her checking account, but it represented freedom and independence for me. Stop, Zara pleaded, tears forming in her eyes. I know I've been selfish. I know I've taken advantage of your kindness, but this isn't the solution. You're going to get us both in trouble. Her concern seemed focused entirely on the potential consequences for herself, rather than any recognition of the harm she'd caused me through months of manipulation and lies. I paused my exploration of her finances to look at her directly. You've been stealing from me for months, I said quietly. Not money, but something more valuable. Time, energy, opportunities. I've been working myself to exhaustion to support your lifestyle while you had access to more wealth than I could spend in a lifetime. You've stolen years of my life that I'll never get back. The apartment fell silent except for the quiet humming of our ancient refrigerator and the distant sounds of campus life filtering through the windows. Zara sat on the couch looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, her carefully maintained persona completely stripped away to reveal someone I didn't recognize. Without the performance of struggle, she seemed somehow less substantial, less real. My phone buzzed with a notification from my banking app, confirming that my student loan balance had been paid in full. The relief was overwhelming. A weight lifted from my shoulders that I'd carried for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. For the first time in years, my financial future looked bright instead of ominous. I need you to understand something, I said, closing her laptop and setting it on the coffee table between us. This isn't about revenge. This is about justice. You've been playing games with other people's lives while having access to resources that could solve every problem you've created. I'm just evening the scales. Zara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. The money I get each month isn't just for me, she said quietly. It's supposed to teach me responsibility, help me understand the value of money. If I spend it recklessly, the trustees will think I'm not ready for full access to the trust fund. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to fund your character development by exploiting your friends, I replied. You've had $50,000 a month to learn about money management, and you chose to spend it on luxury goods while letting other people subsidize your basic expenses. That's not learning responsibility. That's learning how to manipulate people. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, pulling out the folder where I kept all my financial documents. Inside were months of receipts showing groceries I'd bought to share with my supposedly broke roommate, utility bills I'd covered when she claimed to be short on funds, and bank statements showing the gradual depletion of my savings as I tried to help someone I thought was struggling. Look at this, I said, spreading the papers across our small dining table. 3 months of groceries for both of us. 6 months of covering your share of utilities when you claimed your job wasn't paying enough. The money I lent you for textbooks that you said you'd pay back when your next paycheck came in. Each receipt represented a sacrifice I'd made, a meal I'd skipped, an opportunity I'd passed up to help someone who'd never needed help at all. Zara approached the table slowly, her eyes scanning the evidence of her deception and my generosity. For the first time, she seemed to understand the real cost of her performance. These weren't just numbers on a page, they were choices I'd made based on false information she'd provided. Every dollar I'd spent on her behalf had come at a personal cost that she'd never had to consider. I never asked you to cover my expenses, she said weakly, but we both knew that wasn't entirely true. She'd never explicitly asked, but she'd created situations where helping her felt like the natural, generous thing to do. Her manipulation had been subtle but effective, designed to make me feel good about sacrificing for someone I cared about. You didn't have to ask directly, I replied. You just had to maintain the illusion that you needed help. You played the part of a struggling student so convincingly that I felt guilty having any money when you appeared to have none. You turned my empathy into a weapon against my own financial stability. I pulled up my banking app again and showed her my account balance. After paying my student loans, I still had about $3,000 to my name, the result of years of careful budgeting and constant work. By contrast, her monthly allowance was nearly 17 times my total net worth, money that flowed to her effortlessly, while I fought for every dollar. What do you want from me? She asked, slumping into one of our mismatched dining chairs. Do you want me to pay you back for everything? Do you want me to confess to everyone what I've been doing? What would make this right? Her question sounded genuine, but I could see her mind working, trying to find the least costly solution to a problem that couldn't be solved with money alone. I considered her question carefully. What did I want? The money I'd taken from her accounts would certainly improve my life, but it wouldn't undo months of deception and manipulation. It wouldn't restore the trust that had been broken or erase the feeling of being used by someone I'd considered a friend. I want you to understand what you've done, I said finally. Not just the financial impact, but the emotional cost. I want you to realize that your little experiment in poverty has real consequences for the people around you. And I want you to stop pretending that having access to millions of dollars is somehow a burden that justifies treating other people badly. She nodded slowly, but I could see that she didn't really understand. For someone who'd never experienced genuine financial stress, my perspective remained foreign and abstract. She could intellectualize the harm she'd caused, but she couldn't truly comprehend the daily reality of living without her safety net of generational wealth. Over the next few days, I continued my exploration of Zara's financial accounts. Each login revealed new layers of her deception and new opportunities to redirect her wealth toward more deserving purposes. The car purchase was just the beginning of a comprehensive redistribution project that would fundamentally change both our lives. I paid off my credit cards, eliminating the high-interest debt that had been draining my income for months. I covered the security deposit and first month's rent on a studio apartment closer to campus, finally giving myself the option to move out of our shared space and the toxic dynamic we'd created. I even set aside money for graduate school applications, turning a distant dream into a concrete possibility. Each transaction was carefully calculated to avoid detection by the trust fund monitors Zara had mentioned. I kept the amounts reasonable, spacing them out over time, and made sure they aligned with the types of expenses a wealthy college student might reasonably incur. To anyone reviewing her accounts, it would look like she'd simply become more generous with her spending, not that someone else was making unauthorized purchases. The most interesting discovery was that Zara's accounts had multiple routing numbers and subsidiary accounts that she'd apparently forgotten about. Her trust fund was so complex, with so many different streams of income and investment returns, that small amounts could be redirected without creating obvious patterns. It was like finding hidden rooms in a mansion, spaces that existed but weren't actively monitored. Zara herself had become increasingly withdrawn, spending most of her time away from the apartment or locked in her bedroom when she was home. She'd stopped maintaining her struggling student persona entirely, no longer bothering to hide her expensive purchases or pretend concern about money. The stress of having her deception exposed seemed to be taking a genuine toll on her psychological state. "Are you ever going to stop?" she asked one evening, finding me at my laptop in the living room. Her question was quiet, resigned rather than angry. She'd apparently accepted that her attempts to regain control of her finances had been unsuccessful, and she was now focused on understanding the scope of the damage rather than preventing it. "I'm not sure," I answered honestly. "I'm still discovering things about your financial situation that surprise me. Did you know you have a separate account that's specifically designated for charitable donations? It has over $200,000 in it, money that's supposed to be given away to worthy causes." I turned my laptop screen toward her, showing the account details. "According to the trust fund documents, you're supposed to distribute this money annually to maintain your tax benefits." Her face went pale as she realized what I was implying. "You can't donate that money in my name," she said urgently. "The trustees track charitable giving very carefully. They'll want documentation, tax receipts, proof that the donations went to legitimate organizations." But I'd already researched the requirements and identified several worthy recipients that would meet the trust fund's criteria. The local food bank where I'd volunteered during high school needed funding for their new refrigeration system. The campus women's shelter was raising money for expanded services. The scholarship fund that had helped make my own college education possible was always looking for additional contributions. All legitimate charities that would provide the proper documentation for Zara's tax records. "Consider it my fee for financial consulting services," I said, beginning the process of making donations in her name. "I'm helping you fulfill your charitable obligations while supporting causes that actually help people who need it. Unlike your little poverty performance, these organizations work with people who are genuinely struggling." She watched in silence as I made donation after donation, redirecting her charitable fund to organizations that would use the money to address real problems rather than funding someone's character development exercise. Each gift would generate proper tax documentation while putting resources into the hands of people who could make a meaningful difference in their communities. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was probably doing more good with Zara's money than she'd ever done with it herself. Her wealth had been sitting idle in accounts, growing through investments while she played at being poor for the amusement of trust fund managers who wanted to see her suffer appropriately before releasing her full inheritance. "What happens when the trustees review my accounts?" she asked quietly. "They're going to see all these irregular transactions. They're going to know something changed." Her concern was justified. The pattern of spending I'd established over the past week was definitely different from her previous financial behavior, but that might not necessarily be a problem. "Maybe that's a good thing," I suggested. "Maybe they'll be impressed that you're finally using your money productively, instead of hiding it in storage units and living off your friends' generosity. You're making charitable donations, paying for your own education, covering your living expenses responsibly. From their perspective, it might look like character growth." The idea seemed to intrigue her, and I could see her mental wheels turning as she considered the possibilities. If she could frame my financial interventions as evidence of her personal development, she might be able to maintain access to her trust fund while shifting responsibility for the changes to her own supposed moral growth. "I could tell them I had an epiphany," she said slowly, "that I realized how privileged I was and decided to start using my resources more responsibly. They've been waiting for me to show that kind of maturity." Her suggestion revealed just how well she understood the psychology of her trust fund managers, and how effectively she could manipulate their expectations. But something about her quick pivot to finding a new angle for deception bothered me. Even when caught in her lies, even when forced to confront the harm she'd caused, Zara's first instinct was to find a new performance that would protect her interests. She wasn't experiencing genuine remorse or personal growth. She was simply adapting her strategy to accommodate changed circumstances. "You're missing the point," I said, closing my laptop and turning to face her directly. "This isn't about fooling the trustees or maintaining access to your money. This is about recognizing that your actions have consequences for real people. I've spent the last week cleaning up the financial mess you created in my life, but I can't fix the trust you destroyed or the friendship you ruined." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, more uncertain, lacking the confident manipulation that had characterized all our previous interactions. "I never meant to hurt you," she said. "I know that sounds ridiculous given everything I've done, but it's true. I was so focused on maintaining my cover story that I never stopped to think about how it affected you." "But you did think about it," I replied. "Every time you let me pay for groceries while you had $50,000 in your account, you made a conscious choice to prioritize your comfort over my financial stability. Every time you accepted help you didn't need, you chose to let me suffer so you could maintain your performance. Those weren't accidents. They were decisions." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at our apartment door. Zara and I looked at each other in confusion. Neither of us was expecting visitors, and it was nearly 10 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. The knocking continued, patient but insistent, suggesting whoever was outside wasn't going to leave without getting an answer. I got up to check the peephole and saw a well-dressed man in an expensive suit holding a leather portfolio. He looked exactly like what I'd imagine a trust fund manager would look like, complete with perfectly styled gray hair and shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My stomach dropped as I realized what his presence likely meant. "Zara," I called quietly, "I think your trust fund people are here." She immediately went into full panic mode, jumping up from her chair and looking around the apartment as if she could somehow hide the evidence of our recent financial activities. But it was too late for concealment. If her trustees had come for an in-person visit, they already knew something was wrong. The man knocked again, and this time he called out, "Miss Blackwood? My name is Richard Sterling from Sterling Trust Management. I need to speak with you about some irregularities in your account activity." His voice was calm and professional, but carried an undertone of authority that suggested this wasn't a casual social call. Zara looked at me with pure terror in her eyes, all her careful composure finally cracking completely. "What do I do?" she whispered. "What do I tell him?" But I was just as confused as she was. I had no experience with trust fund managers or the protocols for this type of situation. My knowledge of wealth management came entirely from the past week of exploring her accounts. "You answer the door," I said quietly, "and you tell him the truth, or at least a version of it." She shook her head frantically, but I was already moving toward the door. If we ignored him, he'd probably just come back with more people and more authority. Better to face whatever was coming head-on than to make it worse by avoiding it. I opened the door and found myself face-to-face with Richard Sterling, who looked exactly as intimidating in person as he had through the peephole. He was probably in his 50s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of managing other people's money and making decisions that shaped their lives. His gray suit was perfectly tailored, and his leather portfolio looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Miss Blackwood," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but we need to discuss some concerns about your recent financial activity." His grip was firm, and his eyes were sharp with intelligence and suspicion. This was not someone who could be easily fooled or manipulated, and I suspected he'd seen through far more sophisticated deceptions than anything Zara or I could devise. "I'm actually not Miss Blackwood," I said, stepping back to let him enter our small apartment. "I'm her roommate, Keiko. Zara's right here." I gestured toward where she stood frozen by our dining table, looking like she wanted to disappear through the floor. The contrast between her current terror and her usual confident manipulation was stark enough to be almost comedic. Richard Sterling entered our apartment and immediately began assessing everything with the sharp eyes of someone trained to detect inconsistencies. His gaze took in our mismatched furniture, the evidence of genuine student life, and Zara's obvious distress. I could practically see him forming conclusions about what he was observing and how it fit with whatever had brought him here. "Miss Blackwood," he said, addressing Zara directly, "we need to discuss your account activity over the past week. There have been several large transactions that don't align with your previous spending patterns, and the trustees are concerned about potential unauthorized access to your funds." His tone was professional, but carried an unmistakable threat. This man had the power to change Zara's life completely, and he wanted her to know it. Zara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked at me desperately, as if I could somehow provide a solution to this impossible situation. But I was just as out of my depth as she was, possibly more so since I was the one who had actually initiated the transactions he was investigating. "Mr. Sterling," I said, stepping forward before Zara could incriminate either of us, "maybe we should all sit down and discuss this calmly." I gestured toward our small living room area, hoping to buy some time to figure out how to handle this situation. "Would you like some coffee or tea?" My offer was genuine. My grandmother had always taught me that hospitality was important even in difficult circumstances. And then he accepted my offer and settled into our ancient armchair, looking somewhat incongruous in his expensive suit surrounded by our college student furniture. Zara perched on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for whatever was coming next. I busied myself making coffee in our tiny kitchen, using the time to think about how much truth we needed to share with this man. "Miss Blackwood," Richard began once I'd served coffee in our mismatched mugs, "your trust fund was established with very specific guidelines about appropriate expenses and responsible money management. The recent activity on your accounts raises questions about whether you're adhering to those guidelines. He opened his leather portfolio and pulled out several sheets of paper covered with financial data. I recognized the transaction listings immediately. They were printouts of all the transfers I'd made from Zara's accounts over the past week. Every payment was there, from my student loans to the car down payment to the charitable donations. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made the scope of what I'd done feel both more impressive and more terrifying. Can you explain these expenditures? Richard continued, pointing to specific line items on the printout. A payment to a student loan servicer for over $80,000, a donation to a food bank, a payment to a car dealership, multiple transfers to what appear to be educational institutions. His tone suggested he already had suspicions about what had happened, but wanted to hear Zara's explanation before drawing conclusions. This was the moment of truth, literally. We could lie and try to convince him that Zara had made all these payments herself, but that would require maintaining a deception that we were probably not skilled enough to pull off. Or we could tell him some version of the truth and hope that honesty would work in our favor. Mr. Sterling, I said, making a decision that would probably change everything. I made those transactions. Zara didn't know about most of them until after they were completed. His eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained neutral. He was clearly used to dealing with complicated financial situations and wanted to understand all the details before making judgments. And why would you have access to Miss Blackwood's financial accounts? He asked, his question directed at me, but his eyes watching Zara's reaction carefully. Are you an authorized user on these accounts? Do you have power of attorney? His questions revealed just how serious this situation was. Unauthorized access to trust fund accounts was probably a federal crime. I looked at Zara, giving her one last chance to take control of the narrative, but she just stared back at me with wide, frightened eyes, apparently unable to form coherent words. So I took a deep breath and decided to explain everything, hoping that the truth would be better than any lie we could construct. Zara's been lying to me about her financial situation for months, I said, meeting Richard's gaze directly. She's been letting me pay for her groceries, cover her share of rent and utilities, and generally support her while claiming to be broke. Last week I discovered that she has access to $50,000 a month and decided to take back some of what she'd cost me. The room fell completely silent as Richard processed what I'd told him. His expression didn't change, but I could see him evaluating the implications of my confession and considering how it aligned with whatever information had brought him here. Finally, he turned to Zara and asked, "Is this accurate, Miss Blackwood?" She nodded miserably, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "I know it sounds terrible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the trust fund guidelines require me to live modestly and learn financial responsibility. I was trying to follow the spirit of those requirements while still maintaining access to my allowance." Her explanation sounded weak even to me, and I could tell Richard wasn't impressed. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his tone becoming more formal and stern, "the purpose of your trust fund's restrictions is to help you develop genuine character and understanding of money's value. Manipulating others into subsidizing your lifestyle while you maintain access to substantial wealth is the exact opposite of what the trustees intended." He shuffled through his papers, apparently looking for specific documentation. "However," he continued, and both Zara and I perked up at the word, "the recent account activity shows a pattern of responsible spending that's more aligned with the trust fund's goals than anything we've seen in your previous financial behavior." He looked at me with something that might have been respect. Paying off student debt, making charitable donations, investing in reliable transportation. These are exactly the kinds of decisions we'd hope to see from someone learning to use wealth responsibly. I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe we weren't in as much trouble as I'd feared. Richard seemed more concerned with Zara's deceptive behavior than with the technical illegality of my account access. Perhaps there was a way to frame this situation that would benefit everyone involved. "Mr. Sterling," I said carefully, "would it help if I explained my reasoning for each transaction? I wasn't trying to steal from Zara or enrich myself inappropriately. I was trying to balance the scales after months of being manipulated into supporting someone who had far more resources than I did. I hoped that my willingness to explain my actions would demonstrate good faith and reasonable intentions." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to hear your perspective, Miss—" He paused, realizing he didn't know my last name. "Tanaka," I supplied. "Keiko Tanaka." He made a note in his portfolio, probably adding my information to whatever report he'd be filing about this situation. I walked him through each transaction, explaining the financial pressures that had led to my desperation and the reasoning behind my specific choices. The student loans that had been weighing down my future prospects, the car that would open up better job opportunities, the charitable donations that seemed more appropriate than anything Zara had done with her wealth. By the time I finished, Richard was nodding slowly. "Miss Tanaka," he said, "while I can't officially condone unauthorized access to trust fund accounts, I have to admit that your use of Miss Blackwood's resources demonstrates more financial wisdom and social consciousness than we've seen from her in 3 years of monitoring." He turned to Zara with a disappointed expression. "Your behavior over the past several months represents exactly the kind of entitled manipulation that the trust fund restrictions were designed to prevent." Zara looked devastated, but I suspected she was more upset about the potential loss of her allowance than about the moral implications of her actions. "Does this mean you're cutting off my access?" she asked, her voice small and defeated. "Will I lose everything?" Her primary concern remained her own financial security rather than the harm she'd caused or the lessons she might learn from the experience. Richard considered her question carefully before responding. "The trustees will need to review this entire situation and determine appropriate consequences," he said. "However, I'm prepared to recommend that your allowance be restructured rather than eliminated entirely." Both Zara and I looked at him in surprise. This was better news than either of us had expected. "Here's what I'm proposing," he continued, pulling out a fresh set of documents from his portfolio. "Miss Blackwood, Your monthly allowance will be reduced to $5,000, with the remainder being placed in a supervised account that requires trustee approval for expenditures over $1,000. This will ensure that you're actually learning to manage money responsibly, rather than simply performing poverty while maintaining access to wealth. The proposed arrangement would still leave Zara with more monthly income than most college graduates could expect in their first jobs, but would prevent her from accumulating the kind of excess funds that had enabled her deceptive lifestyle. It seemed like a reasonable compromise that addressed the trustees' concerns while still providing her with financial security. Additionally, Richard said, turning to me, the trustees would like to offer you a position as Miss Blackwood's financial accountability partner. Your demonstrated wisdom in redirecting her resources toward productive purposes suggests you'd be an excellent influence on her future financial decisions. He slid a contract across our coffee table. The position comes with a salary of $30,000 annually, plus oversight of the discretionary spending account. I stared at the contract in shock. In a matter of minutes, I'd gone from expecting criminal charges to being offered a job that would solve most of my financial problems while giving me significant influence over Zara's spending habits. The irony was almost too perfect. The trust fund managers wanted to pay me to do exactly what I'd been doing for free. Zara looked at the contract with a mixture of horror and resignation. Having me as her official financial supervisor would be a constant reminder of her deception and manipulation, but it would also ensure that she maintained access to substantial resources, even if they came with more oversight than she'd previously experienced. I need time to think about this, I said, though part of me wanted to sign immediately. The salary they were offering was more than I'd make in my first job after graduation, and the position would give me valuable experience in financial management. It would also allow me to ensure that Zara's wealth was used more responsibly going forward. Richard nodded understandingly. Of course. Take whatever time you need to consider the offer. He stood up and gathered his papers, preparing to leave. Miss Blackwood, I'll need you to come to our offices tomorrow morning to sign the new trust fund agreements. Your account access will remain suspended until then. After he left, Zara and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The entire trajectory of our lives had just changed dramatically, and neither of us was sure how to process what had happened. The man who'd arrived as an apparent threat had instead offered solutions that seemed almost too good to be true. Are you going to take the job? Zara asked quietly. Her question held a note of genuine curiosity rather than manipulation or self-interest. For perhaps the first time since I'd known her, she seemed to be asking about my preferences without calculating how they might benefit her. I think so, I said honestly. The salary would change my entire financial situation, and the experience would be valuable for my career. But more importantly, it would ensure that your money gets used for good purposes instead of funding elaborate deception schemes. She winced at my characterization of her behavior, but didn't argue with its accuracy. We spent the rest of the evening discussing the practical implications of the arrangement. I would have significant influence over her discretionary spending, which meant I could prevent future manipulation of friends or fabrication of financial hardship. She would have enough money to live comfortably, but not enough to maintain her previous lifestyle of hidden luxury and performative poverty. The next morning, I accompanied Zara to the Sterling Trust Management offices downtown. The building was exactly what I'd expected from a wealth management firm. Marble floors, expensive artwork, and an atmosphere of quiet prosperity. Richard Sterling met us in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The contract signing process was surprisingly straightforward. Zara's new financial restrictions were clearly outlined, with specific limits on various categories of spending and requirements for trustee approval on larger expenditures. My role as her accountability partner was defined with equal precision, including my authority to review and approve discretionary expenses and my responsibility to file monthly reports on her financial behavior. Ms. Tanaka, Richard said as we prepared to leave, I want you to know that the trustees are genuinely impressed with your integrity throughout this situation. You could have continued taking money indefinitely without detection, but instead you were honest about your actions and focused on productive uses for the funds. That kind of character is exactly what we hope to encourage in our clients. His words meant more to me than I'd expected. For months, I'd felt like I was struggling alone against circumstances beyond my control. Having someone recognize my efforts and judgment was validation I didn't know I needed. But 6 months later, Zara and I had settled into a surprisingly functional working relationship. She'd moved into a more expensive apartment closer to campus, one that reflected her actual financial status while still being appropriate for a college student. I'd kept my studio apartment but upgraded to a reliable car and eliminated my financial stress entirely. Our friendship had evolved into something more honest and balanced than what we'd had before. Zara no longer needed to maintain her poverty performance, which had freed her to develop genuine interests and relationships. I no longer felt exploited or manipulated, which had allowed me to appreciate her positive qualities without resentment. The accountability partnership had proven beneficial for both of us. Zara was learning actual financial responsibility, making thoughtful decisions about her spending, rather than accumulating hidden luxury goods or manipulating others into covering her basic expenses. I was gaining valuable experience in financial management while earning enough money to pursue graduate school without debt. I need to thank you, Zara said one afternoon as we reviewed her monthly spending report together. We were sitting in her new apartment, which she'd decorated tastefully with items she could actually afford to display openly. I know it sounds strange given how everything started, but you stealing my money was the best thing that ever happened to me. I looked up from the financial documents, surprised by her admission. How do you figure that? I asked. She'd seemed initially devastated by the loss of her unlimited access to wealth, and I'd expected ongoing resentment about the new restrictions on her lifestyle. I was miserable before, she said simply. Constantly lying, constantly performing, constantly worried about maintaining my cover story. I couldn't have genuine relationships with anyone because everything was built on deception. Now I can just be myself, whatever that turns out to be. Her honesty was refreshing, a stark contrast to the calculated manipulation that had defined our early interactions. The trust fund managers had been right about the character-building potential of financial restrictions, but wrong about how to implement them effectively. Zara hadn't learned responsibility from pretending to be poor while maintaining access to wealth. She'd learned it from having her deception exposed and her privileges restructured around accountability rather than secrecy. Besides, she continued with a grin that was genuinely warm rather than strategically charming, watching you take control of my accounts and redistribute my wealth to worthy causes was kind of impressive. I'd never seen anyone be so methodically righteous before. It was actually pretty attractive. Her comment caught me off guard, introducing a dynamic I hadn't considered before. Over the following weeks, I began noticing that our professional relationship had developed romantic undertones I hadn't anticipated. Zara's genuine personality, freed from the constraints of deception, was actually quite appealing, and my newfound financial stability had given me the confidence to consider relationships based on mutual attraction rather than practical necessity. Our first official date happened 6 months after the trust fund intervention, at a restaurant that was nice enough to reflect Zara's actual financial status, but modest enough to align with her new spending guidelines. We talked about everything except money, exploring shared interests and compatible values that had been obscured by months of lies and manipulation. You know, this is going to be the campus scandal of the century when people find out, I said as we walked back to her apartment after dinner. Rich girl and her financial supervisor fall in love after she steals her trust fund to pay off student loans. It's like something out of a romance novel. Zara laughed, and the sound was lighter and more genuine than any laugh I'd heard from her during our months as roommates. Let them talk, she said, taking my hand. After everything we've been through, I think we can handle a little gossip. Her confidence was well-founded. We'd already survived deception, financial crime, trust fund intervention, and radical lifestyle changes. College rumors seemed manageable by comparison. A year later, we were still together and still working successfully within the accountability partnership structure. Zara had graduated with her art degree and was using her reduced but still substantial allowance to fund a small gallery that showcased work by emerging artists from diverse backgrounds. I was halfway through my graduate program in financial planning, using my experience with trust fund management as the foundation for my master's thesis. The gallery opening was our first truly public appearance as a couple, and the campus community reacted exactly as we'd predicted. Some people were scandalized by our unconventional relationship origin story, while others found it romantically inspiring. But most were simply fascinated by the revelation that one of their classmates had been secretly wealthy all along. I can't believe you were literally eating ramen while sitting on millions of dollars, our friend Melissa said at the gallery reception. That's the most extra thing I've ever heard. Her comment was typical of the reactions we'd been getting. Most people were more amused than judgmental about Zara's previous deception. In my defense, Zara replied, it was really expensive ramen. I was buying the organic, artisanal kind and just eating it out of regular bowls to maintain my cover story. Her ability to joke about her past behavior showed how much she'd grown since the trust fund intervention. The Zara I'd first lived with would never have admitted to such calculated deception, much less laughed about it. The evening was a success both artistically and financially. Several pieces sold to collectors who appreciated Zara's commitment to supporting emerging talent, and the local art critics were impressed by her curated selection of diverse voices. More importantly, she'd found a way to use her wealth that aligned with her genuine interests, rather than serving as a tool for deception or manipulation. As we cleaned up after the reception, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that night I'd discovered her banking password. What had started as petty revenge over a Netflix subscription had evolved into a complete transformation of both our characters and circumstances. Do you ever regret what happened? I asked as we locked up the gallery together. The intervention, the restrictions, the way everything changed. I was genuinely curious whether she missed her previous lifestyle, even though it had been built on lies. Zara considered the question seriously before responding. I regret the lying and the manipulation, she said. I regret hurting you and taking advantage of your generosity, but I don't regret where we ended up. This feels more real than anything I had before. She gestured around the gallery at the evidence of her genuine interests and values. And I definitely don't regret falling in love with the person who saw through my bullshit and decided to do something about it. 6 months later, Richard Sterling called to inform us that the trustees had decided to modify Zara's trust fund structure once again. Her demonstrated responsibility over the past 2 years, combined with my successful oversight of her finances, had convinced them to increase her monthly allowance while maintaining the accountability partnership structure that had proven so effective. The trustees are particularly impressed with the gallery project, Richard explained during our quarterly review meeting. Using wealth to create opportunities for others while building a sustainable business model shows exactly the kind of mature thinking they hope to encourage. The trust fund board had apparently become quite proud of Zara's transformation, often citing her case as an example of how proper oversight could turn entitled behavior into social consciousness. More importantly to both of us, the trustees had approved our request to formalize our partnership through marriage. The trust fund documents would be restructured to recognize me as Zara's spouse and co-manager of her financial resources, giving us equal authority over major expenditures while maintaining the accountability structures that had proven so beneficial. Our wedding was held at the gallery, surrounded by the art collection we'd built together, and the community of artists we'd come to support. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by family and close friends who'd watched our relationship evolve from conflict to partnership to love. I know this all started with Netflix passwords and trust fund theft, I said during my vows, but somewhere along the way, it became about so much more. It became about honesty, accountability, and learning to use our resources in ways that reflect our values rather than our fears. The audience laughed at my reference to our unconventional beginning, but I could see that they understood the deeper transformation we'd both undergone. Zara's vows were equally honest about our complicated history. When Keiko first stole my money, I thought she was destroying my life, she said, tears streaming down her face. But she was actually saving it. She saw through the lies I was telling myself and everyone around me, and she had the courage to do something about it. I'm not just marrying the woman I love, I'm marrying the person who helped me become someone worthy of love. 2 years after our wedding, we opened a second gallery location and established a scholarship fund for students from low-income backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in the arts. The fund was structured to provide not just tuition assistance, but also mentorship and networking opportunities that would help recipients build sustainable careers in creative fields. Right. We should call it the Netflix Scholarship, Zara suggested as we reviewed the final paperwork for the fund establishment. A reminder that the smallest conflicts can lead to the biggest changes if you're willing to be honest about what's really going on. Her suggestion was playful but not entirely wrong. Our entire relationship had grown out of a $15 a month streaming service dispute. The scholarship fund became our most meaningful project, allowing us to use Zara's wealth in ways that created genuine opportunities for others while honoring both our backgrounds. Recipients were selected based on talent and potential rather than financial need, but the program specifically sought out students whose circumstances might otherwise prevent them from pursuing artistic careers. At the first annual scholarship award ceremony, I looked around the room at young artists whose futures had been changed by resources that had once been hidden in storage units and spent on designer goods that no one was allowed to see. The transformation wasn't just about money. It was about the difference between wealth used for deception and wealth used for creation. You know what the best part of all this is? Zara asked as we watched the scholarship recipients displaying their work at the ceremony exhibition. These students get to be exactly who they are from the beginning. They don't have to lie about their backgrounds or pretend to be something they're not. They can just focus on their art and their growth. Her observation captured something essential about what we'd learned through our complicated journey together. Authenticity wasn't just morally superior to deception. It was also more creatively productive and personally fulfilling. The energy that had once gone into maintaining elaborate lies could be redirected toward building something genuinely valuable. 5 years after that first Netflix password confrontation, we were featured in a national magazine article about innovative approaches to philanthropy. The article focused on our model of using personal accountability partnerships to transform inherited wealth from a tool of isolation into a foundation for community building. The key insight, I explained to the interviewer, was recognizing that wealth without accountability often leads to deception and manipulation, while wealth with proper oversight can become a powerful force for positive change. The challenge isn't eliminating privilege, it's structuring it in ways that encourage growth rather than stagnation. The article generated significant interest from other trust fund families and wealth management firms looking for models that could help young heirs develop healthy relationships with money. Richard Sterling's firm began offering accountability partnerships as a standard service, using our case as proof of concept for their effectiveness. But the real measure of our success wasn't media attention or professional recognition. It was the life we'd built together based on honesty, shared values, and mutual respect. What had started as a petty dispute over streaming service access had evolved into a partnership that transformed not just our own lives, but the lives of dozens of young artists whose careers we'd helped launch. Do you think we would have found each other if the Netflix thing had never happened? Zara asked one evening as we reviewed applications for the upcoming scholarship cycle. We were sitting in our home office, surrounded by portfolios and personal statements from aspiring artists across the country. I considered her question carefully. Maybe eventually, I said. But it would have taken much longer, and we might not have learned the lessons we needed to learn about trust and authenticity. The conflict forced us to be honest with each other in ways we probably wouldn't have chosen otherwise. The Netflix password dispute had been a catalyst for conversations and revelations that might never have occurred under normal circumstances. Looking back, I realized that the most important theft hadn't been when I used Zara's trust fund to pay my student loans. It had been when she'd stolen my trust through months of deception and manipulation. And the most important recovery hadn't been the money I'd taken, but the honesty we'd both gained through the process of rebuilding our relationship on firmer foundations. The trust fund that had once been a source of shame and secrecy had become a tool for creativity and opportunity. The deception that had nearly destroyed our friendship had become the foundation for a love story that inspired others to examine their own relationships with money and power. And the Netflix password that started it all had become a family joke, the streaming service we'd eventually share openly and honestly, like everything else in our lives.